When I was growing up, I wanted to be two things: a writer or a mermaid. And so I went into an industry where I could do both: write and design stories for video games, and then, as a gamer, get my vicarious thrills virtually as a mermaid, or as a gun-toting archaeologist, or as a young boy with psychic powers, or even as the wind itself. I took my geekery and I turned it into a profession. But today I want to talk to you about the challenges that writers, writing, and stories face in video games. Look at some of the reasons those challenges exist and how we might better overcome them. So first, let's take a look at stories and why they're important in games. Because let's face it, not every player cares about story in games. Not every game needs a story. Tetris did just fine without one. But when there is a story in game, ideally it should be a good one, and it can also provide some valuable functions to the game. It can help give the game context and meaning. And as a player, it can really help you care about the game you're playing and not just understand it. And it can also define the logic of a game world and give you a reason that there's a game to be played in the first place. OK, so let's look a bit at how writers fit in. I call myself a writer because it seems the most applicable title for someone that writes scripts and designs stories for video games. But the longer I've worked in the industry, the more I come to feel that this title's not actually that accurate for what I do, at least when I'm being used to the best of my ability. Moreover, there's a bit of an attitude in the industry that writers equal people who do the word bits. And often word bits are thought of as cheap and easy and can be slotted in wherever or whenever in the process. So how is a writer used in games? Well, as Alison was talking about earlier, story and script is at the heart of most entertainment mediums. But in games, it's a little bit more like the lymphatic system. So not necessarily understood or appreciated, but very important conduits that feed into various aspects of the game. So let's look at a couple of them. First is cutscenes. Now, these are movie-like sequences that often do a lot of the narrative heavy lifting in the game. And they come in two main forms. So non-interactive, and this is a bit like a TV scene or a scene in a movie, where you just watch the action unfolding in front of you. In the case of a game, the control is taken away from the player, and they're forced to watch what's happening, or often skip, which is the bane of writers' lives. And you get this situation where it's a non-interactive part of an interactive experience. And so cutscenes can be not particularly popular in certain sections of the industry. And that's why we've got the second type of cutscene, which is interactive. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So this means that a player is given full or limited control within a scene. So this could be something like the game Half-Life 2, where players were held within a room, and they had full movement within that room. And the characters sort of spoke to each other and spoke to the player and moved around them. And it was a bit like theatre in the round, and the player could do what they liked within that space, but they couldn't move outside it. Or you could have something like Batman Arkham Asylum, where the player is given a narrative conceit for having limited movement or limited visuals, such as being strapped to a trolley or walking in manacles and being slowed down. So how's a writer involved in cutscenes? Well, this seems a kind of a comfy, happy place for a writer to be. It's in pretty familiar territory. But there are various things that need to be considered when writing cutscenes that wouldn't necessarily be considerations in other entertainment mediums. So first is gameplay and space. So back to the interactive cutscenes. Now you're having to think about, is the scene going to be in a room? Is the player going to have full movement in that room? Is it a scene that's going to go through part of a level? Is the player going to be held in some way? Is there going to be a narrative conceit for being held? Suddenly you're having to think about the level design and work with level designers to make best use of the narrative space around the scene. Second is hardware and budget. You simply can't write crowd scenes if the engine you're working for can't actually render crowds very well. Likewise, you have to learn that cloth, particularly silk, water, steam, characters doing lots of touching is very, very heavy on animation. therefore it can be very heavy on hardware, therefore it can be very heavy on budget, which producers particularly hate, and so you have to learn how to use these things very, very minimally. Also, character interactions. So now you have to think about what happens if the player tries to break a scene in which they have full control, and they pull their gun on a character, or try and shoot a character, or try and bounce a monitor off their head. How is the other character going to react? Are they going to kind of do nothing? Are they going to pull their gun? Is there going to be a fight? Or is it just going to kind of continue as if nothing happened? So now you're having to think about the mechanics of the game and how they feed into the scene. And so what we can take from this is, one of the things I'm very passionate about is, if you want to write for games, you should play games. I'm asked all the time by writers, how do I get into games? And I was like, oh, okay, so you're a gamer, you like games? And like, no, not really. I mean, my kid plays, and it sort of seems remarkable to me that people could think about going into an industry and have really no idea of how that industry is consumed by players. And so I always advise, if you want to write for games, you need to play games. As I showed you with cutscenes, there's actually a lot that you can pick up as a player of how these things are put together. So you need to know your medium. You wouldn't seek to write a movie without actually watching a movie or reading some screenplays. It's the same with games. Okay, environmental storytelling. Environmental storytelling is pretty big at the moment. It's quite a hot topic. It textures the narrative and it enhances the themes of a story. And it's pretty common for most entertainment forms. But when it comes to games, the available real estate you have to tell the story within is huge. It's bigger than any film. It's bigger than any TV series. And so there's a lot you can do to broaden and texture and deepen the narrative. A good example would be something like BioShock, which, as well as using slightly more traditional forms of storytelling, so little cutscenes that were sort of semi-non-interactive, semi-interactive, and audio diaries, it also used the world to tell its story. So the decaying environment, advertisements, sound, even the position of corpses were all utilized to tell the story of the world. So let's look at how a writer is involved in environmental storytelling. Well, it's a little bit unfamiliar from what writers are used to. We're getting away from kind of regular writing territory. But you need to consider freedom, and this is a good but. Suddenly you're now moving outside the confines of a 90 to 120-page script. The whole world is potentially your script. So there's a lot you can do with it, but you have to work within a team. So you're no longer writing in isolation. You're building a world with a team of people. So as well as level designers and gameplay designers, you're also working with artists as well. So think beyond the script. You've now got a chance to broaden, texture, and deepen your narrative across a huge space. And the other area I want to talk about a little bit is level dialogue. Now, as well as cutscenes, as well as environmental storytelling, you still have to continue the narrative through the parts of the game. So that's predominantly what level dialogue does. And it can also help guide the player through the game, give them some hints, a little bit of color about the world, comments on the characters or the situation that they're in. And usually this is done one of three ways. By voice in the ear, it's something the player character can hear, like Splinter Cell or Metal Gear Solid, or we also use that in Overlord. Internal or external voice of the character, so something like Alan Wake, for example, where he talks to himself, or you can hear the thoughts of the character guiding you through the game. And then there's also other AI, so something like Prince of Persia, which has a secondary character called Elika, who goes along through the game with the prince, and she gives sort of comments about the world and hints about what they have to do next. Okay, so looking at how a writer is involved in level dialogue, now you're really moving out of familiar territory for a writer. So it's really uncertain. But you've got to consider these things. The game comes first, and many writers will find out that there's still a lot of people that think the game should always come first. But it's nowhere more is that the case in level dialogue. So when it comes to how this works in the game, if a player has to be directed somewhere, if they've got to have a hint about something, if the play testers have come back saying, I got lost in this bit, we need a little bit of dialogue that tells me where to go or something like that, then you have to find a way of doing it as a writer. And this means that a lot of the challenge is finding the sweet spot between character and information. Therefore, whatever needs to be imparted to the player, whether it's a hint, direction, a little bit of color, that comes first. But you've also got to find a way of putting that across that doesn't break the character of the game or the tone or the character's voice. And that can be a really, really big challenge. So narrative must serve the game. So I've talked about the different ways that games writing is very, very unique from other entertainment mediums. And so back to looking at the role of a writer, it's actually so much more than that. It's like being part director, part set dresser, cinematographer, scene builder, costume designer, and even a casting agent at times. But the knowledge that's required of how games are played and the limitations of the medium is actually really essential when you're writing for it. You need to understand how level design is put together, how mechanics can impact on the scene, how space can impact on a scene. So I've talked a bit about how a writer can be used in games, and that's really an ideal situation. But unfortunately, it's far from the industry standard. And through my career in games writing, I've come up with a couple of other titles for how a writer is actually used in games. Story robot and narrative paramedic. And I'm actually badging up on those. See, Marius got my badges on. And you'll notice that neither of them actually contain the word writer, and they're a little bit on the derogatory side. So this is why. Writers are still the new kids on the block. So before professional writers were hired for projects, and that's still a relatively new thing to do. It's becoming a little bit more commonplace. Before professional writers were hired, anyone used to do the writing. Anyone who fancied to go would do the writing. The producer who did poetry in his spare time, the designer who fancied to go, the programmer, whatever. It was all, it's all game for anyone to have a go at writing. And it was the only part of a game's development that actually wasn't done by a professional. So actually integrating writers into the team is also a new thing. So companies have got over the fact that actually hiring professional writers is a good idea. They're getting professional writers in, and they don't really know what to do with them. They're a bit of a kind of a square peg trying to fit into round holes. These are sort of strange creatures that seem to value words and story over gameplay and mechanics. So we get the situation that writers are often hired too late. As I mentioned before, about the writers being considered people who do the word bits. And so people think words are easy and cheap, and they can just go in wherever, whenever. And so this means that writers can be hired a year after the game started, or something like 6 to 3 months before the game is shipped, which really puts writers at a disadvantage with what they can actually do to help the narrative. And writers are often poorly integrated. As I mentioned before, they're sort of square pegs trying to fit into round holes. And the industry doesn't quite know how to use them properly yet. And games writers themselves are also trying to find out where they fit in the industry. So unfortunately, you often get this situation where writers are kind of boxed away from the rest of the team. They write in a vacuum. They're not allowed to talk to the level designers and the artists and the gameplay designers and get all that valuable information that can inform things like cutscenes, be they interactive or non-interactive, environmental storytelling, and they're just kept away from all this very vital information. Okay, if you don't believe me, here are a couple of stories from another couple of games writer friends of mine. Asked to write a 100,000 word script in a fortnight. When I pointed out that this was the length of a novel, they admitted they'd left things a little bit late. I declined the job. Yes, this actually happens, and these are not the worst stories, believe me. During a debate on how to retain player sympathy with a central character, a designer said he had a better idea of how to do it because he'd seen more movies than me. Really, really not joking. So as I demonstrated, that games writing is still very much an uphill struggle. It's a challenging medium to write for, but there's also some old attitudes and prejudices in play that make it occasionally an uncomfortable place for a writer to be, and more often than occasionally, if I'm being honest. But we are heading in the right direction. We have more titles like BioShock, like Mass Effect, like Portal, that are showing how powerful storytelling can be. But if we want to make this an industry standard, then we have to start facing these problems head on. And now looking back to the title, to define is to limit. And I'm thinking about this, actually in games we are defined by our limitations. And the real challenge is working out what limitations we have to work within and we have to accept, things like technology, things like working within the space for level, and which of those limitations we need to challenge or change, things like getting in writers in early. What I really like to see is actually more of an evolution. I realize that the title writer isn't the problem, it's the perception that's the problem. And so I feel that writers need to evolve to suit the medium. They need to understand games and gameplay and design and how everything's put together and the limitations. Why? Because games matter. Likewise, the games industry needs to evolve to help grow the craft of games writing. They need to put these old prejudices and attitudes aside and actually kind of embrace the craft of games writing and help improve it. Why? Because stories matter. After all, we're all on the same side. Thank you very much.